Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly. It's your friend Rick from Blind here, and I have the great privilege of introducing you all to Donna Helphrey. Donna is the Vice President of Talent at Go1. So she's responsible for developing and implementing the company's culture and talent strategy on a worldwide basis. Go1 makes it easy for organizations to learn. The company curates content from top learning providers to deliver education and training across all industries and topics. And for folks who might not be familiar, Go1 has raised over $400 million to date. Its last round was more than $100 million in June 2022, and its last public valuation is more than $2 billion, so a double unicorn there. Thanks for coming on the show, Donna.
Thank you for having me.
So I was particularly impressed with your background, and so our audience is not as familiar, so I want to kind of take that step back to begin with. Can you walk us through your career and how you decided on recruiting and talent acquisition?
Sure. Happy to. So I don't know that it's a real glamorous story, but it is mine. So happy to share. Right out of college, I thought I wanted to be an event planner. And, I was like, oh, this is going to be really fun. I want to plan parties. I want to be in the details, be in the scene and stuff like that. So I got a job doing just that. And my day would start at 6:30 in the morning, wouldn't end till about 11 o'clock at night. Once I did the math, I probably made $6 an hour.
Oh
Um,
no.
and I just was like, what am I doing? So I'd done it for a couple months, and this was in the 90s, and there was another Donna there. So she was called Donna and I was called Puppy. And I was like, weird. And so after about 2 months, I went into the boss's office and he said, Puppy, what's happening? And I was like, no can do. Like, this is not for me. And he's like, give me one more month. I'll take you to New York. I'll take you here and all these things. And, as the low man on the totem pole, one of my jobs was to guard the ballroom, okay, at one of the events and make sure no one came in. And I'm like, I'm 23 years old. What am I going to do? Throw these people over my shoulder? Like that's just not going to work. And then another chore of mine was to go to the airport at O'Hare. I'm in Chicago, and drive somebody to every terminal. And they went out with the sign to pick up the VIP people. And I was like, yeah, I don't think this is for me. So anyway, shortly after, I went to a staffing firm and I said, I with the intention that they would find me work. And I was like, I had an apartment that I was moving into for the first time with girlfriends in the city. And I was like, I need a job. And I was like, I'm not too proud to answer phones or whatever it is you need me to do. And they said, do you want to work here? And I was like, sure. So the
Wow.
company at the time was called Richard Micro Group, and it was in the late 90s, and they were acquired by Randstad. So it's a global staffing firm. So I worked there for about 3.5 years. And there was a kind of a time in that early stage where I was like, I don't know, maybe I want to be a high school guidance counselor. And so I had done the legwork to enroll in DePaul. And I was like, wait a minute, all these classes are at night. Because in my mind, I was like, I'd go to school during the day, I'd wait tables at night, make money, this and that. And so, after doing some finances, I'm like, I'm going to be $40,000 in debt to maybe make 40,000. And a couple had just started a staffing firm in downtown Chicago, and they had one client, which was the Wrigley company, and no employees. And I got connected to them, and they're like, I know who you should talk to. And I was their first employee. So then I went there, and that was a company called Northbridge Staffing Group. I was there for about 8 years, and that was incredible. Again, working for a couple, it gave me a really good foundation into recruiting because, there essentially would be a home for everybody, but not everybody in the, like you worked with all these different clients. So maybe the person that KPMG was looking for isn't the same person that the American Dental Association is working for. And when I think I was 26, and not knowing, a lot of stuff about industries and stuff, it gave you a really good breadth of knowledge of, corporate America, nonprofits, all those things. But you were also compensated by your work. So like you had to hustle and, get these candidates to the people the fastest, and they had to be the best because it was a commission environment, and that's how you got paid. So I was able to hire, I think we got up to 15 employees at one point. Sales, I don't even remember, but definitely in the millions for a small company. So it just was a really incredible training ground. But also Ronstad was too, because it was like a classroom setting of, several months of like, here, this is what you're going to do. And if you survive, great. And most people didn't make it out of the training. And this was at the time, I mean, we didn't have internet. So I was cold calling out of a phone book, and I had to write down every call I made, 150 a day, document it. And every time I hung up the phone, my boss would criticize how the call went. And I was like, ugh. And looking back, I was like, wow, that was the best thing that's ever happened to me. Because I don't think people do that anymore. You're not going to criticize everything they do, and you're not sitting in an office. We had to wear suits, and I mean, it was wild. So again, it was a really good foundation. So after 8 years at Northbridge, I got to a point where I was like, I need to start doing things I'm afraid of. This is a great job, great company. They treat me really well, but everybody was just like me. It was all young white girls, besides the couple, the husband and wife. And there was, 15 of us. And then, at some point there was maybe 9 of us. And I was like, I don't know, I want to work with people that aren't just like me. And, I approached my boss, because I'd been there a long time, first employee. And I said, it's about time, to phase me out. So we had, really healthy dialogue, and he's like, go for it, like start interviewing. And, he kind of was like, go see if the grass was greener. And at the time, I didn't find anything right away. And Groupon had approached me about a position. And I was like, that's probably not the right job for me. And that was in June of 2010. And then in August, they came back and said, by the way, the director of recruiting is going to take on a role in HR. Do you want this job? And I was like, yes. So I went there, and they had a pretty solid team at the time. There was only like 400 employees at Groupon, but there was already 7 recruiters. And, we were tasked with, I think at one point, I think I put in there, I know I've hired 1,800 people in a year and all that crazy stuff. So anyway, went to Groupon, great experience. I was in a position where maybe on paper I wasn't really qualified to do. I'd never even worked in-house before, but somebody gave me a chance and trusted me to say, hey, she can figure it out. I didn't work for a global company, but with anything, you're going to stretch yourself. And Groupon was notorious for, that you're going to get hired, and you might be, knowledgeable for A through L, but you're required to do A through Z, and so like building a team underneath you of really, really good people. So it takes a village. I didn't single-handedly do this myself. Then this past February, it was President's Day. Groupon been going through some changes, and we had gotten a new CEO the previous winter in December. And, they were in this trying to reinvent themselves several times. And I'm like, I've been here for almost 12 years. Maybe it's time. And my boss was like, I gotta go. And I said, listen, you just took the guilt off the table. I'm right behind you, but I would do this job with you anywhere that you are. I just adored working for her, adored the team, those types of things. But writing was on the wall that, it was probably a good time I started exploring other things. And this opportunity presented itself. And, I had never heard of Go1, which was a really natural, and still to this day, as I interview people, they're like, no, what's that? And so it was, one, I wasn't sure what Go1 was. And secondly, I was like, my day can't start at 5 p.m. And so my boss was like, understood. And this was communicating through the exec search firm. And she's like, just have her talk to us. And, obviously each conversation was better than the next. And here we are. So it was something that, the non-negotiables for me in a job have always been like the people and the product. If I'm going to be the face of this and encourage people to leave their jobs and join me here and join us, then I have to wholeheartedly get behind it. And it definitely checked all those boxes.
Donna, it's so interesting. I don't know if you're aware of this. You probably are. But when you went there and interviewed at the first recruiting firm and they wanted to hire you, that's how I got hired. And that's how so many other people got hired. It's a thing where you go there, you go to the staffing agency back probably the same time as you did. And, you're not sure what to do. And they're like, hey, you would make a good recruiter. Would you like to join us? And I hear that story, Donna, so often now. I don't know if they would like do that for everybody or if they thought like anybody had some sales experience, a little salesy, a little schmoozy, gift of gab, immediately like, wait, we'll take them. We'll take the person.
It is funny because most people, I've only met one person that said that, oh, they went to college and knew they wanted to be a recruiter. And, she's a little younger, so maybe it was more of a hipper career as it got, further on, but I didn't even know what it was. I was like, okay, you want me to cold call? Okay. And it was just one of those things where I was flattered and I had a job and I was, able to pay the bills and call it a day. And so you do kind of just fall into it.
It is. It's one of those things. It's not like when you're a kid, I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a fireman. I want to be a recruiter. Hey. That the last one. No, it's not usually what goes on. That's not part of the conversation.
Yeah. So I've been really fortunate for, people taking a chance on me and, it's all worked out. And, I'm thrilled to be here, but I also have a lot of gratitude of where I came from. I didn't leave either or all three of them. And I've literally had 3 jobs. Ron said I was there for 3.5 years, Northbridge 8 and Groupon 12. Like people are like, wow, you're a lifer. And I was like, you treat me right. And I do what I need to do. Then, we're going to be in this for the long haul, but yeah, I have a lot of gratitude for the experiences that got me here.
So Donna, how was, if you don't mind asking, from Groupon, because it was one of those companies that, to me, from the outside perspective, came from out of nowhere, just blew up, like everybody heard of it. And then, I don't know, then all of a sudden, kind of, you don't really hear too much about it. What was it like working there? Were you at the early, I know you said about 400 people, but was that like early on? Like
yeah, so Groupon started in 2008 and I got there in 2010.
Wow. Okay. Right in the financial crisis, right? Probably right. The worst time.
Then we went public in 2011 and we went public in November of 2011. And then all of a sudden in like January or shortly after 2012, we were in 37 countries and we had 17,000 people.
Wow.
Okay? So I don't know anyone that could do that well. That is pretty sloppy. And I remember, the head of HR was fantastic and we were really close and, just finding out like, we don't even know who's on the payroll in Brazil, except on a spreadsheet, so there was all this like massive undertaking of getting us on the same, HCM and systems and processes and procedures. And the term one playbook plays back in my head that you're like, oh boy. So I think the early stages of Groupon though were so exciting because again, you got really excited about a coupon. And so you had 2 things. You had the surprise and delight of what that deal was going to be because you only got one deal of the day. And then the second thing was there's the sense of urgency because you had, 24 hours for the deal or it goes away. And then there was that tipping point. Remember, you would tell merchants like, hey, enough customers have to buy this. I'm going to guarantee you, 5,000 customers. And in some places it would sell out like 25,000 customers, so it was, in the 2010, 2011 freak of nature because everybody was excited about it. But then what happened was there was a zillion copycats. So even if you're not using a Groupon, some people still say Groupon, like Coke to mean pop. So it was this household term, but then there was, all these copycats like Retail Me Not, Guilt, coupons.com, everything. Okay. So being on the inside, it was, again, how do we reinvent ourselves? How do we get into these different verticals that other people aren't doing? Okay. And I could name off 30 that, successful or not. I mean, some of them were crazy. And from being on the recruiting side, it was like, hurry up, Donna, I need 300 people for Groupon now, and they need to be staffed in 2 weeks. And I was like, okay.
Well, how do you do that? Like, how do you get, with a full-time permanent or,
Well, yeah, they were. And so we did use some agency help for a lot of things, especially like our customer service and things like that. But what was really cool, again, in the early stages of Groupon is we had a pretty awesome office environment in downtown Chicago, right on the river. And, let's say for customer service, we needed a couple hundred people, but they wanted them from like the improv scene. They wanted these people to have this voice that, this voice of the customer came across as really cheeky and fun and quirky and all that stuff. And so that to me was awesome, because I'm like, these people are dying for benefits and some steady work, and they can moonlight, on the side and do their acting and do all that stuff. Okay. So that part was easy. But when you're going to get more specific criteria, again, as a public company, you need to build out a finance team. You need to build out treasury, tax, audit. I mean, like, it's very different, And so at one point, my team probably got up to about 30 people. And again, so I would verticalize them into specialties like, hey, you support marketing, you too support finance, you support engineering and that type of thing. So you're going to have specialty areas, but again, 300 people in 3 weeks is not feasible. And what we did at the time, we were on a system called JobVite, which was our ATS. And I literally sent mass communication to everybody that had applied in our system saying, hey, we're hosting this job fair. These are the roles, these are the pay, this and that. Sign up at this time. We'll see you then. So it was job fair around the clock not around the clock. We did sleep. But again, in the early days of Groupon, though, I worked almost every Saturday because we had to hire so many people, and there wasn't the logistics or time during the workday with the hiring managers, with even office space available to interview these people. So we would host these basically interview career job fairs, every Saturday till we got staffed up to where we needed to be. But people were like wanting to do it, like it was, again, like the sexy thing in Chicago, like the first like tech company and stuff like that. So the verticals did get a little crazy because, some of them were a huge miss. I mean, we got into food and delivery. You guys probably have never even heard of this. And it was called Order Up. Okay. And so we're competing with like the Grubhubs and the DoorDash. And then you get to a point where you're like, well, there's actually companies out there that do this and do it really well, and we're not one of them. But, for me, it's a little heartbreaking because one of the reasons I'm in the recruiting side of the house and not necessarily the HR policy police side of the house is I love the build. I love finding people careers. And when all of a sudden, that doesn't work out and these people no longer have a job, I'm like, so I saw that play out a lot of times. And so again, with all the copycats and things that didn't work out, I also think we went public way too quickly. We expanded by global acquisition way too quickly. And then, when you're rearranging the chairs of leadership and somebody's trying to catch up and all those things, and I probably was the most stable of, so I saw all this churn, but I also saw a lot of success. So there's definitely some good, some bad, but again, from a hiring standpoint, there was a variety of things that we needed to do to put in place. Like I have this Groupon Global Talent Acquisition Behavioral Interview Guide. So what was cool is, my team was like, I'm like, why don't we build something? This doesn't exist. These hiring managers are going into these interviews kind of blind, and they don't even know what to ask these people, so let's figure out what are our habits, what are our values, what are our, our must have, like ownership and performance. Here's the questions, and here's what good looks like. Here's what mixed looks like. Here's what poor looks like, so really guiding them through that. And we were able to, create in-person trainings. Those went on for about, we did them quarterly, 90 minutes. We would record them for people that couldn't attend, and they had like a short, like, hey, what is it I do? Because I think there's a real misconception that anyone interviewing wants the job. So hiring managers think that, like, oh no, they want this job, or they want to talk to me, or any job I post, it will be like, hey, and culturally, like for me, how are we making sure we have a diverse pipeline? Gender, how do I make sure I've got some females in the mix? How do I make sure I've got some ethnic diversity? And it's hot, but it's easier said than done. Like I don't have access to, their personal details when I'm looking at a resume in an ATS, but it's taking, hey, all these phone calls, all these Zoom screens to make sure that I've narrowed down the funnel to get them a great slate of candidates. And again, teaching the recruiters that have worked with me and under me, and I still am a hands-on recruiter. I'm at Go1 now, still doing roles. Like I have 3 active recs myself. So I'm doing the work alongside them. So it isn't like I'm like, oh, this is what you need to do. And, like giving them guidance and not knowing that it is hard, because again, you're making, assessments and judgments off of people's life decisions. So I think that, there's a lot of variety of ways it could get done, but I think adding some structure around, again, what I mentioned before, the build versus the buy, like, hey, what are some non-negotiables that these people must have? And I think in areas like engineering, areas like finance, like I can't teach somebody to be a treasurer, or a tax accountant. That's not my wheelhouse, so there's certain things that, it sounds like common sense, but I think if you establish all that criteria, at the kickoff point, and we call them like strategy calls, because we want to make sure that the hiring manager and interview team understands that they have some skin in the game here too. I'm like, these people are working for you, not me, so here's things that you think might be common sense. Like, hey, make sure you're on time. Make sure you've looked at their resume. Again, they sound like real basic, just nice to have, but it's like, sometimes you got to really lead a horse to water to be like, no, okay. So, don't be on your phone and don't be eating, and especially when you're at home, like, hey, if your room's a mess, that's indicative of maybe, like you. So like, and having to guide people that way has been, comical, but, obviously very interesting and more necessary than I thought.
Now it has to be a wild change to where you are now, where you have only 3 recs, in a whole different kind of company, right?
No. I have 3 myself. The team works on other things too. So I shouldn't say we only have 3 open jobs, but I have 3 myself. Yeah, I will say the difference. So there's a lot of differences, I think, working for a US based company than versus a company that's outside of the US. And you're going to have, geographical challenges no matter what. Okay. But I'm used to, when I came from Groupon, I had Europe, India. I did have one person in APAC, or one person in Australia. But yeah, those touch points were a little different. But what's been nice and kind of a breath of fresh air is I wake up in the morning and there's going to be a lot of unread Slacks, a lot of unread emails, but they're sleeping. Okay. So it gives me time. I can go to a 6 a.m. yoga class. I can come home, shower, grab my coffee, get in my Zen space here and really be present for like, okay, what's priority? What do I need to respond to? That type of thing. We're here, somebody has access to you at all times, and I felt like there was a bit of a shock collar, like, oh, if I didn't respond quick enough, I also got a text, I got a ping and an email, and I'm like, all right, everybody just take a breath. And so that's been a welcome change. But again, figuring out different means of of communications, like educate, communicate, socialize, all those things multiple times, because you, again, don't have the luxury of being awake at the same time when things happen. So that's been, a little bit different, but I think, again, this is a smaller scale, but the difference here is, we're hiring, some in the US, hiring some in Europe, but it's a household name in Australia, not in the States. So really educating people, hey, this is what Go1 does. And I think the mission driven and purpose, I mean, our goal is to get to 1 billion learners. And in today's world, that really resonates with people. And I think, people understand, like, hey, anyone that touches our product is better than they were before. Maybe your class is 30 minutes, but you learn something in that class. And, we're meeting learners where they're at, which has been exciting. And I think when I got here, there, again, wasn't real structure or rigor around hiring. And they had one recruiter in Australia trying to hire for all of the US and Europe. And I'm like, Jess, you poor soul, how did you do this? She's like, well, I managed, 3 different time blocks for these regions. And I was like, that's not setting anybody up for success, And so understanding that, hey, we need people in region to understand the landscape of the hiring market. Hiring in Europe, as you guys probably know, each country has its own nuance, and somebody in Australia doesn't know all that stuff, and they really shouldn't, and try to stay, really on par with what's happening. So I was able to hire, so I've got 2 people in the US, 1 person in Dublin, and 3 people in Australia. So that kind of covers our bases from like a time zone perspective and knowledge sharing of like what needs to happen. Yes, the volume is lower. And I think that was really due to, macroeconomic conditions and making good judgment calls of like, hey, there's a lot of things out of our control. It really doesn't make sense to double headcount at this point when we don't know what's going to happen with the world, so like, let's take the pedal off the gas. Because when I was hired because there was going to be, huge hiring goals. And we'll get there. We just took a more reasonable, conservative approach so that we don't have to lay off a bunch of people because there's things that are happening that we can't control. And I really had a lot of respect for that.
Donna, just to get a better sense, what does Go1 do exactly? Do they aggregate a whole bunch of different courses online? Is that how it works, or something like that?
So it's an ed tech platform, and we're industry agnostic. Okay. So it could be anything. It could be finance. It could be hospitality. It could be mechanics. It could be wherever. And we've got, partnerships with large companies, with HCM, such as like SAP, Workday, things like that. And we're able to have a plugin, and these people have access to all of our learning content. Okay. And we don't create all the content. So we've got content partners like Docebo, Coursera, Skillsoft, Harvard Business Review, all those things, that are already a part of the content, and new content's being created all the time. But we also have a curation team. So I think that that's been one of the biggest like allures, that these companies get these playlists. And it's like, what is it that our people need? So they're not left to their own devices of like, hey, let me search up software development, Java, how I learn, coding for dummies or whatever. It's like, your people need this. Yes, we have our standard compliance stuff, but I think really, the real meat of what we do and what sets us apart is going to be learning and development and upskilling your employees. And, what I think is cool, and it's June 1, so it's Pride Month. And so I woke up this morning to somebody on the curation team was like, hey, happy Pride Month. And they created a month's worth of playlists. So each week it's a different subject. Like, what is the LGBT community? How do we support them? What does being an ally mean? So I think, even from like a social impact state where like you're able to encourage people to own their own learning journey, but you're going to give them all the resources to say like, hey, this is what you can do to better yourself. And again, it could be work specific, but I also think this other piece of it connects employees and makes us feel like really inclusive. And back to the hiring piece, what's cool too, is there's several courses on how to be a great hiring manager. How do you mitigate bias? We all have it. You might want to say you don't have it. We all have it, like you're going to see someone that went to your college and be like, ooh, or, grew up in your hometown, or, you're finding these likenesses that, make you favor somebody over the other. So that type of stuff. And for us, like we've created, a whole playlist of like, you want to interview, before you do that, you must take these 3 courses, and then we can, talk about it. And there's quizzes at the end and those types of things. So I don't know if I answered your question or if I just derailed into something else, but I think those are some of the differences that make it a little bit, from a learning standpoint of like what we do.
Now, I'm curious about the hiring aspect. I mean, from a candidate's perspective, you noted how different it is from the recruiter or the employer perspective in terms of how challenging or how different or unique it is for an international company to be hiring across so many geographies and cultures. From a candidate perspective, is there anything that I should know if I'm going to work at a country that, maybe is not founded in that country, maybe it's not in the US, that might be different in the job interview process? Or should I expect kind of a local experience if I'm, a candidate in the US applying for a US job?
Yeah, so good question. I would say depend on the role. Okay.
Okay.
For example, I'm in the process of hiring some executive roles.
Okay.
So when half of the executive team is in Australia, you're going to have some time zones that maybe aren't ideal. But what I found with Australia and the people I interact with, they're real early risers. Like they prefer to meet with me at 6 a.m. my time, or 6 a.m. their time, or 7, which is my 3 p.m. or 4 p.m., which is great. But I'm also on Central Time. So if you're West Coast, you got a little bit of a buffer. I would say, we definitely have recruiting presence within region. So it's going to be, kind of a standard process. But I think having headquarters in Australia gives you like, I don't know, I thought to me, it was cool because there's so many things that are like again, like cheeky and like different words and things that they use. I mean, one day there was pictures all over Slack of somebody brought a kangaroo in the office. And I was like, whoa, things I never thought I would see at work. So like, there's just differences, but I think those differences are very welcomed. I mean, an interview, no matter what, is going to be a conversation, not an interrogation. You want to make sure that, hey, people are comfortable. I want to give them all the detail. And, we're still kind of a startup. I mean, Go1's been around since 2015, in the US since 2018. So we say we're not really a startup, but more kind of this like awkward teenager, where things are going really well. And we had, we got to here, but how do we get to here? We've hired a lot of leadership in the US. We have a new CFO that's in Las Vegas. Our CMO is in California. Our head of product is also in California. So you'll have this dual leadership in both places. And there's also leadership in Europe. So I think it's very similar to working for any global company that, sometimes people in the US might say, hey, decisions are made while I'm sleeping. And that happened at Groupon all the time. Well, it's like, okay, well, this is kind of the nature of the business and get on board. But you also still have a voice to say like, hey, I've got some concerns, or can we talk about this? A thing that kind of connects us all at Go1 is every week, every Friday within region, there's an end of week call. Okay. So it's recorded and it could be, people focus, it could be product focus, it could be marketing focus, it could be, anything. And there's a host within region and you watch it and then you're like, oh, I feel really connected, even though like my team personally, I've only met 2 of them in real life. So that's different. So how is it that I'm making sure that we still have a human connection and can build a relationship, outside of like, oh, you have all these recs you're working on. I mean, like that stuff is important too. So I think the interview process would be the same. I think, there's more casualness in Australia than there is in in the US, but I wouldn't say there's anything that, regionally would be very different.
Do you find some regions or roles more challenging than others to hire in?
Yeah, I mean, US is still a challenge a bit because again, people don't know who we are.
Right.
And once you tell them, then I think people get excited and, it makes the outreach part a little harder because they're not going to, we obviously have LinkedIn and we have our ads posted and things like that, but we're not a household name. So they're not going to seek us out. So having to do a lot more passive sourcing in the US and Europe than we do in Australia. Obviously, the job market has changed a bit because there's a lot of really good qualified people open to working and looking for their next opportunity. So I think it's important just to stay really top of mind and networking, and everybody knows somebody good. I think good people know good people. But yeah, I do think like the US brand recognition as well as Europe of Go1 is not as great as it is outside or in Australia, I should say.
Now, I'm curious because you've kind of seen it all. You've recruited agency, in-house, kind of almost every company stage, right? From Groupon startup days to, uh, you know, just right before its IPO, and certainly once it became a public, huge global company. Do you have any tips or kind of behind the scenes tricks that you can share about recruiting for the professionals that are listening right now that might be looking for their next role?
Yeah. So I think your LinkedIn network and profile is very important. I think make sure that you're not applying to every role because you're getting a little desperate, especially from our lens on an ATS side. We use Greenhouse. I can see one person and it will say applied to, 7 roles.
Oh,
What
interesting.
are you qualified for all 7? And at Groupon, we had a much higher velocity of positions. So it would be applied to 28 roles. Well, and from my lens, it's like you're just kind of reaching at anything. And I do think be specific enough to what you're, essentially qualified for, but take some stretches. You don't have to have, especially females, they're more reticent to not, if they don't meet all the requirements, they're not going to apply. I think having a lot of, curiosity of, hey, tell me more, be open to things that maybe, you weren't considering before. Like some people will flat out tell me as I reach out to them, like, oh, you're not headquartered in the US. No, thank you. Okay, then this isn't for them. But it'd be interesting if they, would talk to me and say like, oh, what's your concern about that? And
Right.
here's my experience with that, because again, they're going to think like, I mean, they flat out were like, no way. We're a smaller company. We're probably 650 people. I mean, we did just acquire Blinkist, which is really exciting. And that's 160 additional people. So we're some smaller than maybe some would like, but I do think like do things that maybe you weren't thinking this is my perfect job and good things will come, like again, my gut reaction when somebody reached out to me about this was like, yeah, no. And then I was like, but why don't I talk to them? And again, I met with Ash, my current boss, and I was like, this works. Like we were able to, be on the same page and like, to me, again, it's like the people, the product, the sustainability of where are we going to be in 12 months? Where are we going to be in 2 years? And again, like after week 1, and they had told me, they're like, hey, we're not going to be hiring as many people as we initially told you. And of course I was like, okay, and then they explained why. And I was like, I love that. I think that is a responsible corporate decision to do, as opposed to going back to the board and saying, yeah, we're going to hire all these people and hope it works out. Like I'm not in a position where I want to play chicken with anyone's lives. I mean, like I have a family, I have a daughter, I have a mortgage. I mean, like we're all human here, and let's have them have some psychological safety that they feel good about, like, hey, this is going to be here tomorrow. And that's a hard thing to do right now. So again, I would just say network, use your network, make sure your LinkedIn looks good, make sure there's good content on there of things you've actually owned or accomplished. one thing that does kind of annoy me when I looked at people's LinkedIn profiles and then they just tell me like a definition of the company under, say their job title, in the company, and then they just tell me what the company does. And I was like, well, I could look that up myself. Tell me what you do. So I think that that's an important thing to share with people. Again, be engaged in the process and be your own hype person. Like, why is it that I need you? And I'm going to make them comfortable. We're going to have some good dialogue, and then I'm going to get to the meat and substance of that. And so I think, again, just be prepared with like some depth as opposed to some high level of like, yeah, I worked here. What did you own? What are some things that you can put as your, superpowers or your badge of honor of these are the things that I've done.
No, I find it interesting that advice about just as a candidate being open about kind of your non-negotiables and different things that, you know, you might say like, hey, I don't want to work for a non-US based company because I don't want to deal with time zones. And a job candidate might think that, it might disqualify them from a job, or, they might be nervous to like bring these up in the first place. But I
Yeah.
love that advice about saying, no, just have like a human conversation,
Well,
and maybe we could find a workaround, or maybe we can kind of even find an
yeah,
exemption, right?
right.
Like,
Like I'm in a situation now where somebody candidly said to me like, hey, I can't I'm a single parent and I can only travel on the weeks I don't have my kid, divorced or
sure.
whatever. And I was like, okay, let's, she goes, I want to be very transparent about that. And I said, I think that's fantastic. I'm gonna share that information. And I think there is a workaround, like that's not a deal breaker. And like, again, you got to be upfront with some of those things and say this is some things that I can, negotiate on. And these are some things that I can't. In my lens from working from an Australia company, like I've never worked on a Sunday. And again, when I was going through the process, I kind of was like, am I going to have to? And that's a real thing. Cause like Sunday night, it's their Monday morning, and to this day I haven't. And there are times where I'll
Oh,
get up
nice.
and I'll respond to certain things. And my boss is like, it's Sunday night, the work will be there tomorrow. And I'm like, I know. So making sure that again, you have those boundaries and the company that you work with and for also support that.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I think a lot of job seekers are surprised about what they can negotiate and ask for. Like
Yeah.
my favorite example is um, there was a company that I work with, but they had just moved offices to a part of town that was completely new development, didn't have public transportation. Our first 4 months of that new office, there wasn't even a sidewalk in front of the building. It was that new.
Mhm.
And I don't drive. I've been a city boy my entire life.
Yeah.
And I asked the recruiter, hey, this sounds really foolish. And this is a great opportunity. Love the offer, but I don't drive. And so it's going to be really difficult for me to get to the office. And you've been telling me about how great parking is, but I don't have a car, right? So it's kind of irrelevant. What can you do? The public transportation isn't that great. And we negotiated a Lyft stipend where, every single month they were like, just take Lyft to and from work. We'll pay for everything. You'll have a company car, no questions asked.
Wow.
And it was this unique, kind of fabulous benefit
Yeah.
that I think I would have never, I certainly wouldn't have known to ask for it. But just
Sure.
by being honest and starting that conversation,
Yeah.
the recruiter and the executive said it'd be a dumb reason for us to lose a candidate if they couldn't get to the office, right? They couldn't get to work.
Right.
Um, what's a few $100s a month?
Absolutely. And even like companies that are open now on, this hybrid work environment or, remotes, or again, the amount of money you're saving in gas and parking and buying lunch and all that stuff, like that's significant, and you might be like, hey, this is going to be a great job. I might have to take a little less salary or something, or like, hey, I've got all this unvested stock. Well, okay, walk away from it because I think my quality of life is going to get a little better, so just kind of thinking through like those things. I think that's another good place to start.
Oh, I love it. And I mean, I do have one kind of question that I'm going to take advantage of my time with kind of a high level talent executive. Our community is fascinated by the incentive structures of recruiters. You've mentioned if you're at an agency, it's very commissioned and sales based. You're always hustling. It's a rush. What is a recruiter's typical goal or OKR or KPI? Does it differ between if someone's, agency or in-house? If I'm a job seeker, should I get more excited that there's a outside recruiter because maybe they'll hustle more for me? Or, is it great that like I'm speaking with the head of recruiting
Yeah.
at the actual company itself?
So I've got two things to say on that.
Okay.
Talk about the commission is obviously going to be different, but I think again, the world is different. So there used to be, like these metrics, like you needed to hire, at Groupon, we'd be like, hey, a corporate recruiter can hire 2 to 3 people a month. A sales recruiter would hire between 5 to 7 a month. And that's a lot. That's pretty high volume. And then a
Yeah.
tech recruiter about 1 or 2. Okay, well, when they don't have the role, the recs, that's not on them that they're not meeting these goals, And so again, the world has changed a little bit. So like the metrics I care about from an in-house recruiter are going to be candidate satisfaction, and they do get surveys and I measure that, hiring manager satisfaction, time to fill. And again, there's going to be some data that doesn't always tell the whole story. As well as, again, like how are we getting some, diversity into the pipeline? That's important, but there's no points or, you're not getting paid for that in an in-house company. So an in-house, you're going to get a base salary, and both at Groupon and Go1, there is a bonus, and it's made up of business component, company component, as well as a personal component. So that personal component is going to be like, how is it you show up? And like, again, I'm going to get feedback from everybody you touch, is it your hiring managers? Is it the candidates? Is it your peers? Are we really good partners to the comp team? Do we work with HR really well? Like we're all on one team, like this isn't us versus them. So I want to make sure, like, are you raising your hand? Like this sounds silly, but I'm a big, like, show your face on Zoom. And there's going to be times you don't feel like it. And I get that. And just be like, hey, I've had a day, I can't be, but if you're going to be remote, like get engaged. Don't just like have your camera off, not say anything and be like, okay, well, I've done that meeting, and again, in this remote environment where you don't have the luxury of building that, network and all that stuff in the drive-bys or whatever. So in-house, you're going to be, evaluated differently. In the agency side, again, it's been a while. I had a revenue goal I needed to hit. So it was like a sales job per se. And there's, again, a lot of incentive, and you got really excited to be like, oh my God, I just filled that placement. So let's say the placement was an average placement is a 20, now it's 30 or 33%. But back in the day, and I didn't do like real executive search, it was 20%. The fee was 20% of the person's salary, first year cash. Okay. And then the recruiter got, I think 15% of the 20% or something, whatever. It was fairly lucrative, and then you filled the job, you had this like, oh yes, off my plate, we're done with that, and then you move down to something new where as an in-house recruiter, well, you have a sales team of 700 people, not at Go1, but let's say at Groupon. That role doesn't ever go away. You're always going to be hiring, and you're kind of like, oh, I'm still having this conversation, whereas in an agency person, you get, these recs, you fill the job and, you've moved on to another company. So, yeah, I think there's I took a significant pay cut leaving agency side to go to Groupon, but then there's upside and you build your way up and it all pays off. But I needed to do that in order to get in-house, to say like, hey, I'll take this, I won't get commission. That's okay. But I know that there's, bonus incentives and stock incentives. And if I do well, I'm going to have a a career that, could eventually be pretty, upward and, could be to the rights and, linear in different ways. So yeah, there are very lucrative recruiting opportunities, especially in the exec search world. But when you had said, oh, I'm talking to an exec search, they're going to hustle more for me. I can sell this better than they can. I'm like, I do work with a lot of agencies and I've got really good partnerships with people that, again, have great networks and I trust that are going to get good people for me, not just throw bodies at me. And there's going to be people I can't find. I'm, humble enough to say, like, they do good work and they have big sourcing teams and all this stuff. And, right now I'm one person, trying to do multiple things, the sourcing, the scheduling and all this stuff, but I know this better. And I could intimately say, hey, these are the ins and the outs, and this is where you're going to fit in. Where, the search firm has, they've had 30 minutes with me or so and met with, some people on the executive team and they're not living it, so there is value there, but I know in some areas I can do it better. That might sound a little egotistical.
No, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because you're actually embedded in the business, you know what's coming up ahead, you live and breathe the culture.
Yeah.
And so you're able to like explain the day to day, whereas someone that's not as connected, someone that's external, they have to like think like, oh gosh, like it's this company, like what's unique about them again, or like what benefits do they have? Or they might have to check with someone, right?
Right. And I've got some real skin in the game for this to go well. And so that's important to me. I want to be part of the build and I want to be part of the selection process and, who's going to be the right fit for us for the long term.
Right. And I mean, to sum it up, it also sounds like no matter if you work with a in-house recruiter or a external, recruiting agency, they're both incentivized by getting your butt in the seat, right? So they're not really incentivized to, like lead you along or like, drag out the time or even kind of lowball your offer, right? Because they want to get your butt in. They want you to sign the offer ASAP. It
Yeah,
seems
but
like.
I also want the person to stay. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
like, to get the, button seat ASAP and then they leave in 3 months, that does me
Doesn't
no
do
good.
any good. Yeah.
No, and I'm doing this again. And again, I'm pretty transparent. What you see is what you get. And I want to make sure that they know, hey, this is what you're getting into. I'm going to tell you the good. I'm real passionate about the good because again, I can feel it. I live it. I breathe it. But there is some stuff that, isn't so great. And like, you're going to find that in any environment, but let's talk about that, and say, hey, what works for you? Like the other day, I had this candidate and then I got a time to get him scheduled to do something. And my gut reaction was to write back being like, no can do. It's like 9 p.m. his time. And then I was like, you know what? Not fair of me. So I went to him and I said, hey, this is your decision, not mine. And he was like, no, actually that works great. Let's lock it in, And I was
Oh
like, well,
wow.
glad I asked. Cause I was like, well, that's a pretty poor candidate experience. And again, there's certain things that I just want to make sure that I'm being very upfront about. No lowballing that doesn't do us any good either. And they go get a $30,000 pay increase and I'm back at square one. Churning bodies doesn't make a successful company, So again, there's definitely some skin in the game there for it to work out. And I don't expect lifers. I don't expect people to be in the same job for 12 years like me, but a couple years where you feel like you've left a great footprint and moving on, then that's a really good success story.
No, I appreciate that insight and kind of the walkthrough in terms of your career arc. And it's like almost kind of like a jungle gym, right? Where it doesn't have to necessarily, you don't necessarily have to feel pressure to kind of follow a straight, like, linear line and say, like, I need to, be this level in like 2 years or anything like that. But really trying to figure out, like, what can I learn? What is best for me and kind of my life stage right now?
Right.
And, what's out there.
Totally. Like again, am I treated right? Do I treat people right? Do people want to work with me and for me and vice versa? And again, does it fit into my lifestyle? And I'm willing to hustle. I'm willing to put in long hours. And like here, it's nice because my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday gets a little wonky, 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. It's different. But then Thursday, it's like, and then Friday is a dream because it's Saturday there. And you're like, I can catch up and I can do all the things. And again, it's a little non-traditional, but it makes it work for me.
Gosh, I love this advice and this like sneak peeks into kind of working globally. Thanks so much for coming on the
Thank
show,
you.
Donna.
Yeah.
Thanks, Donna.
Thank you.